Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 11th of July. We have really important developments, starting with Krasnohorivka, then Novoselivka Persha, finishing off with Siversk and Makiivka. But as I said, we're going to begin with Krasnohorivka, where the Russians were able to advance 1 kilometer deeper into the northeastern corner of the town. And so I'll show you guys the measurement for the advance before we actually get into the details of this encounter. And so you can see it's about 1 kilometer of an advance westwards in the western direction. So let's explain that in this region in eastern Krasnohorivka, a lot of these trenches that you see marked in yellow, they were rendered superfluous. That's because the Russian forces did not attack these positions head on. The Russians acknowledged that they were way too fortified, even if the Ukrainians did not have a particularly large garrison here. It was just so well built over 10 years, and a lot of mines in the process reaching along those open fields. And so it just wasn't worth it when you make into account the cost benefit analysis to assault head on. And so the Russian forces found a gap along the rail line further south. And that's how they were able to actually infiltrate into Krasnohorivka. And then they continued pushing throughout spring through the residential areas into the refractory plants. And that was where they conducted their vector of attack. In the process, it really rendered these positions useless, and the Ukrainians were forced to abandon them as they were getting flanked and as the Russians were taking over higher elevated positions in southern Krasnohorivka, which is a part of a broader ridge that overlooks the northern half of Krasnohorivka. And so what you saw manifest over the last couple of months is a Ukrainian withdrawal from all of these 2014 era trenches that were set up. And as that unfolded, the Russian forces were able to then pounce and get control over some of these eastward suburbs. And they were able to reach the central road over here that bisects Krasnohorivka. And from there, they had this sort of linchpin to begin attacking into the apartment complex that you see marked over here that I'm pointing towards. That apartment complex was so important for the Ukrainians as it sort of neutered Russia's essentially height advantage by taking over a ridge, but then having control over this really massive complex filled with high elevated apartments overlooking the entirety of the battlefield. Any sort of Russian advances were under the Ukrainian line of sight. And so the Russians were able to then infiltrate into that complex and expel the Ukrainians throughout the month of June. And then they took it over fully by late June. And that just helped galvanize the Russian momentum here and help them push even deeper into this eastern corner. And so really a manifestation of that Russian pressure, both coming from the east, but more so from the southern direction, from really directly attacking towards some of these districts. And also the fact that the Russian forces this past week began assaulting the park area over here, which includes some soccer fields to the south and a lot of shrubbery. The fact that they attacked over here did contribute to trying basically cutting off some of the connection between the Ukrainian garrisons in the eastern corner and the western corner of Krasnohorivka as the Russians got closer to the roads that were connecting them together. And so there's a logistical aspect on a micro level. And then on the macro level, there's also this very big issue that I keep on bringing up surrounding Krasnohorivka. It's the fact that it's the only settlement the Ukrainians control over here in this massive field of just massive portion of land that is actually an organized settlement where you could have a large number of forces gathering and lodging and fighting for a protracted period of time. So you have to go basically 9 kilometers westwards across the Vovcha River and towards the favorable trenches and heights to finally reach an organized line. And so imagine trying to conduct troop rotations here. Imagine trying to resupply. There aren't many paved roads. There may be only one that is further north over here leading into Krasnohorivka. And then you have to cross through these open fields every single day under the very intense shelling coming from the Russian artillery grouping right outside of Donetsk, which we know is very strong. And yeah, it makes it very difficult for troops to get resupply. It makes it difficult to move into reinforcements. And then it makes it even harder for the troops that are mounting this campaign at ground zero of the front line. And so over time, even if they're stationed in rather strong positions like this hospital region, it does become difficult to hold on to it. And that's what happened. The Russian forces did not really have to flank the hospital from the south as they were able to directly advance through this horizontal road here and this horizontal road here and push past the hospital region, push past the duplexes that the Ukrainians controlled and reach some of the private residential areas. And in the process, as you can see, they were able to capture this entire shape of land. It's a rather large piece of territory that came under their control at a fast pace. And now the front line is based around this road, and it's basically reaching the park region where you have some shrubbery the Ukrainians may be taking advantage of, and they do still maintain control over the northwestern corner where the Russians have been involved in this protracted campaign of pushing from house to house under Ukrainian drone shelling a lot of the time. And so what I just talked about, this advance by the Russians, was confirmed by the 59th Motorized Brigade when we saw footage from their unit launching this massive wave of FPVs onto Russian dugouts that are likely stationed a kilometer or two east of the line of contact around these trenches that the Ukrainians set up and are now occupied by Russian soldiers, and especially in houses. We saw a lot of strikes onto apartment buildings that the Russians took over, strikes onto houses again catching on fire, and that gave us the geolocations needed to confirm the Russians are advancing over here. And it shows us that you do still have the 9th Battalion of the 59th Brigade operating here, which is a sign that the Ukrainians were forced to redivert some elements to defend here because the situation was deteriorating. Because the 59th Brigade was previously stationed like 10-20 kilometers north, defending in an area like Krasnohorivka and Atelove, and the rest of its battalions still are, but that one battalion, the 9th, had to be moved further south. And so the final part of Krasnohorivka to keep in mind is that you do have this relatively wide suburb that the Russians have not touched yet, and it's divided by the Lazova River. The Lazova River is a really narrow river. There are some ponds, though, in the region, and so those could pose a physical threat for the Russians to cross over. But you do have a lot of floodplains here, so it is a low-lying region, making it very difficult for the Ukrainians to defend this suburb all on its own, especially given how isolated it is from the rest of the Ukrainian garrison in this general direction. And so the Russian forces, having both the geographic and also structural elevation advantage, would have a very good line of sight from both the east and the south to fire towards these areas. And they have recently started some artillery preparation, some FPV strikes onto some of these warehouses from the Phoenix drone group, which is a Russian UAV operating team. And yeah, you can see how that's just the final part of this Vovcha River East Bank that remains under full Ukrainian control. And that's where you have all of the defensive units like 111th, 80th, for instance, or Voron that are still operating here. Now moving on to the Pokrovsk direction, as I now refer to it, I'm not going to rehash the entirety of the Ukrainian defensive lines here and the geographic dynamics because I feel like I do that in every video nowadays. But what I will say is that we do have two updates to look at. First of all, the Russian forces were able to advance northeast of the village and are now either very close or have actually infiltrated into the village itself. And so the vector through which they're doing this is Novopokrovsk, and the Russian forces here are supported by the higher elevated regions in this hill marked in the rectangle, which directly overlooks the Ukrainian positions in the center of the village. And so we have this video over here, which was released on the 11th of July. And you can see how the Russian forces generally advanced just directly east, either with vehicles along this road or directly on foot, trying to use the concealment of the bushes and tree lines to reach into the outskirts. And so here they were spotted by the Ukrainians, and the small squad was targeted by grenades that were dropped from those drones. That's the confirmation that we have. You have these groups that are just trying to creep up their way and then establish a sort of bridgehead within the village and expand from there. And they're doing this from several directions, because although we talked about the eastern side, the northeastern direction is even more active because you already have Russian forces congregating just outside of the village in Novopokrovsk, and they are so close in Novoselivka Peresha, they could just very quickly reach the warehouses and the ponds here, and they do have the tree lines in the hills to support them. And so it's now being mentioned by Russian sources, and I don't have videos to confirm this, that this northeastern vector has been successful and they infiltrated into the center of Novoselivka Peresha, and that the Ukrainians are gathering whatever reinforcements they have in the region to conduct counterattacks. They're increasing their use of FPVs on the Russian garrison, cannon artillery, and for now the Russians are saying that these counterattacks have been unsuccessful, and they're claiming it's because they were able to create logistical bottlenecks for the Ukrainians based on their advances on flanks. And this is basically what I've been talking about for the past week, how the Russian forces, in preparation for attacking this final stronghold east of the Vovcha River, they did try to shape the battlefield by advancing from Voskod southwest and getting control over river crossings, getting fire control, or being able to just see directly towards areas where the Ukrainians would pass through to supply Persha. And that's contributing to Ukraine's difficulty in moving reinforcements to actually defend that area. Now, as we look further north, we do have confirmation that the Russian forces captured Voskod. I believe this did happen sometime this week, but pretty early on in the week. But now we're getting the confirmation, and this is based on footage showing Russian vehicles that advanced from Sokil into the village, and this was done by the 30th Motor Rifle Brigade, one of the Russian units that has been really important in capturing Ocheratina and all the villages since, and also the Pietnashka Battalion, which is a DPR unit, which is made up of Abkhazian fighters, and so they do have their own forward elements that were involved in the Avdiivka battle, and they're still fighting here ever since, providing support for the other Russian units. And so this is not a new frontline change, but what is the fact that now we have confirmation from the Ukrainian side that the entirety of this stronghold, this just strong point with trenches west of Yevaniivka, is under Russian control. And then the one other defensive structure here is currently in the gray zone, as you have Ukrainians basically fully withdrawn from this part of the Vovcha River, trying to consolidate control around Vovcha Progress, but even then not even having a large presence, as most of their forces in this region are stationed in villages that are centered around the railway embankment, and then some of their forward companies are stationed along the trenches west of the river. Now we're going to move on to the Siversk salient, which recently I've started talking about a lot, and I think that in the future we'll also have to cover it, and I'll explain why. Over this past week, there have been two important developments that have put the garrison in Siversk really in danger that they haven't faced in really a long time, I'd say in 2 years. This is the most threatening time for them over the past 2 years because, when you had the fall of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, that was threatening because you had this worry that the Russians would just continue advancing west. But the garrison here was able to hold strong and bog down the Russians in fighting in Verkhnokamiansk and Belohorivka, taking advantage of the local geography and buying time to build up defenses on the eastern perimeter. But since the fall of Spirny, and now we're going to see this advance east of Rozdolivka, now they're threatening new flanks of the Ukrainian defenses here. And so what we saw following the capture of Vesele and the infiltration by the Russians last month into Rozdolivka is the Ukrainians were prepared for this and did begin setting up a makeshift line of defense running horizontally all the way to the rail line, essentially connecting between the rail line to the Bakhmutovka River, which you see over here. And, it's filled with these rather small trenches in comparison to some of the other ones you see from the Ukrainians, but they were built on the front line, so that's part of why it turned out that way. There's also a lot of dugouts built under trees and such. And now you have finally infiltration by the Russians into this line of defense before the Ukrainians were even able to pull all of their men back into that area. Because remember, there's still Ukrainian forces that are basically fighting just outside of Rozdolivka, no confirmation yet that it's been captured fully by the Russians, although maybe there will be now. And so before the Ukrainians could even consolidate full control here and fully withdraw, they're already having this line undermined. And this is also an issue because the line of defense the Ukrainians set up here is located on a really important height. This height, it stretches just north of Vesele all the way to the fields south of Vimka within this rectangle generally. And it overlooks so many villages, both Russian and Ukrainian. But because now we're looking northwards, then we could say, for instance, on the Ukrainian side, it overlooks the entirety of the Bakhmutovka River Valley. So basically, I'll mark it in blue for you guys. All of these regions in blue over here that are running parallel to the local road here or the rail line leading all the way to southwestern Siversk. All of this region is overlooked by the ridge, essentially, that the Russians are now pushing through. And you could say the same thing about the rail line and Vimka and the trenches leading into southeastern Siversk. So the entire southern flank is now in danger of being overlooked and also physically being attacked, basically. So the Russian forces here were able to advance. Let's measure it. It's about 2.5 kilometers northwards. Rather large advance given the pace of advances here in recent years, really. But let's look at the geolocation. It shows video of Ukrainian drones dropping grenades onto a Russian soldier that was able to make it into the tree line here, into a trench. And yeah, they were targeted by the drone. But regardless of that fact, it does confirm a Russian presence here. And it's an area that has a relatively low Ukrainian troop density, which does make sense because this area, it has held strong for a long time. It hasn't been the site of the most fierce fighting, especially because it's mainly open fields here. There aren't a lot of massive population centers, not until you reach Siversk, for instance. And so much of the defending here has been relegated to the 10th Mountain Assault Brigade, at least one of its battalions, and then perhaps you have the 54th Brigade floating around here, although I haven't seen them that active. Same goes for the 118th Brigade. They may be around here, but I just haven't heard much from them recently. But in any case, they're going to be needed now as the Russians are pushing through this region, which will have effects. Now let's look at the physical aspect. Now the Russians have a vector of advance that leads directly to the south of Siversk, and that could lead to issues with Vimka because Vimka is already being threatened directly through this rail line vector. And so now you could see the combination of the west and east pincer beginning to attack the hamlet directly, and it's not a really sizable area, not many trenches here. The trenches are further east around Ivano-Darivka, and that's an area where you already have Russian momentum because they just captured Spirny. And so this is what I'm referring to. There is a much broader challenge for the Ukrainians here because the push in Spirny is putting Ivano-Darivka and the trenches nearby into a lot of peril, and then you could say the same thing about this Russian advance over here. And so you could see a unification of these two attack vectors, which would give the Russians a very strong push just to the south of Siversk, as we've been talking about. And that entire southern region is located generally on a connection of valleys and floodplains. And also, it's an area that is less fortified than the eastern perimeter, because you could see that in hindsight now, it would make sense to build a lot of the defenses just south of Siversk. But of course, at the time, 2 years ago, the issue was with a direct attack from the east, and so that's where you saw most of the unified line being built. And so now you have these Ukrainian forces that are much more exposed from this direction. Now, in terms of the other villages here that are along the river valley, they're also basically being overlooked and could be attacked directly, and so they're also in grave danger. But the sort of silver lining for the Ukrainians is that they control this massive ridge that sort of gives cover and protection for the frontline forces in this region just south of Makiivka. And it's just this open area with, forested areas and fields, just a massive hill over here. And it is an extension of the embankment on which the canal is located, the Donbass Canal, which then connects to the Donets River. And so you could see here a visualization of how the ridge sort of spreads out from the canal. And lastly, looking at Makiivka, there's two reasons why I want to mention this part of the front line today. First is because we have this new video released by the Ukrainian side, not this one. I always click on the wrong markers, but this one over here. And it's located on that particular vertical road that connects between various villages on the eastern bank of the Zherebets River. And so in this video, you have the 107th Territorial Defense Brigade. The drones dropped grenades onto Russian infantry as they were advancing towards Makiivka on foot. So this is not any sort of mechanized assault, which would be difficult in this region in the sense that it would put a lot of the armor at risk. So the Russians, instead of taking advantage of the vast amount of foliage to try to gradually push through tree lines with individual soldiers and then reach certain strong points along the river and try to secure crossings before they're physically destroyed. And that way they would hope at least to get a bridgehead past the Zherebets River in this area where they sensed that there was a particular weak spot with the Ukrainians. And that's why they're advancing along several axes, not just one. They're trying to push and see if there's an exploitation opportunity in several areas. And of course, in this area where they were advancing to the north, they were targeted by the Ukrainian defenders. And the drones did, of course, yield casualties. Of course, that's what happens when drones spot people out in the open. And this also confirms to us that the 107th Brigade is operating here. This unit from Chernivtsi, it has experience from Bakhmut a year ago, basically, but also it was operating in the region just to the east of Kharkiv and Vovchansk, and we didn't have a good idea of where it was operating up until about a month ago when it was redirected to the Luhansk front, probably because they wanted to fill any sort of gaps here and prevent Russians from crossing over the river. And so this unit was involved in basically cooperating with Azov and 66th Brigade in defending areas around Novovodiane and now you could say Makiivka. And so that's all for today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.